The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting golden rays across the secluded cabin nestled deep in the forest. Caleb and Margaret had carved out a peaceful life far from the bustling cities and distant from the violent past they once shared. Their days of assassination were behind them, replaced by the quiet laughter of their two young children, Adam and Lily. They had found peace. But peace, as they had always known, was fragile. Margaret stood by the kitchen window, watching her children chase each other outside. Caleb leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his sharp eyes following every movement. Even after all these years, the instincts of an assassin never truly faded. Their past lingered in the back of their minds like a shadow, but they had convinced themselves that no one would ever come for them here. That illusion shattered in a single instant. Without warning, the skies darkened, and a deep, unnatural hum reverberated through the air. Margaret's heart lurched as an alien ship tore through the clouds, descending with terrifying speed. Its sleek, obsidian surface glistened, and its sharp edges screamed of a predatory design. Before either of them could react, the ground erupted around them. Caleb moved first, his training kicking in as he grabbed Margaret and ducked just as the explosion rocked their home. Their world was plunged into chaos. Alien soldiers, towering figures with reptilian features and gleaming, armored exoskeletons, descended from the ship like specters of death. They moved with terrifying precision, shooting anything that moved. Caleb's mind raced as he pulled Margaret to her feet, his heart pounding with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. "Adam! Lily!" Margaret's scream was raw, a mother's instinct overriding the shock of the moment. She darted toward the open yard where their children played just moments before. But Caleb grabbed her wrist, his voice cold and urgent. "They're gone." His words landed like a hammer. Margaret's legs gave out beneath her, the weight of his statement too heavy to bear. But Caleb couldn't afford to grieve. Not yet. They were still alive, and as long as they were alive, they had to fight. "We have to go." His voice was hoarse, full of pain but steely with determination. He pulled Margaret to her feet once more, forcing her to move. The sounds of the alien soldiers tearing through their home and the screams of their children echoed in her ears, but she pushed forward, following Caleb through the thick forest. They had planned for this, prepared for this nightmare scenario, even if they had never fully believed it would come. Beneath their quiet life, they had always been ready. The cabin, now in flames, was soon far behind them, but the soldiers were relentless. They tracked them through the woods, firing shots that split trees and ignited the underbrush. Caleb and Margaret moved like phantoms through the dense foliage, their assassin reflexes turning them into prey no one could catch. Yet, for all their skill, the loss weighed them down. Caleb could feel Margaret's despair in every movement, but there was no time for comfort, no room for weakness. A clearing appeared, and Caleb pulled Margaret into a hidden cave, shielded by thick vines. They collapsed against the cool stone walls, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with the effort of survival. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing. Then the silence was broken by a soft sob. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the dirt floor, her face pale with shock. Caleb crouched beside her, his voice low but firm. "We'll kill them," he said, eyes dark with an icy resolve. "All of them." Margaret's eyes, glassy with tears, hardened as she met his gaze. There was no room left for grief now, only revenge. Caleb squeezed her hand tightly. "We're going to make them pay." Hours passed before they dared to emerge from the cave. The alien soldiers had moved on, likely believing their work was done. But Caleb and Margaret were still alive. And as the sun began to set, casting the forest in hues of red and gold, they stood together, side by side, in the ashes of their former life. The aliens had taken everything from them, everything but their will to fight. Caleb and Margaret had been two of Earth's deadliest assassins, and now, they would become its most dangerous avengers. As they looked toward the distant horizon, where the alien ship had disappeared into the stars, a silent vow passed between them. They would track these invaders across the galaxy if they had to. They would find those responsible, and when they did, they would show them the true meaning of fear. Their children's faces flashed in their minds, and that memory was enough to stoke the flames of their vengeance. There would be no peace, not until every last one of the aliens who had destroyed their lives was dead. With nothing left to lose, Caleb and Margaret set off into the night, leaving behind the remnants of their past and stepping into a future soaked in blood and fury. The stars stretched endlessly across the void, cold and indifferent to the vengeance burning in Caleb and Margaret's hearts. They had left Earth behind, tracking the faint trail of the alien invaders through the lawless fringes of the galaxy. Each stop on their journey brought them closer to the truth, but the cost of information was steep in this underworld where survival meant constant violence, treachery, and deception. Their ship, a stolen freighter retrofitted for stealth, drifted quietly into the grimy spaceport of Zaros 3, a desolate planet on the edge of the Outer Rim. The stench of desperation clung to the air here, and the port was a den of smugglers, mercenaries, and criminals, exactly the type of place where secrets festered and spread. Margaret stepped out first, her eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced gaze of a predator. Caleb followed, his hand brushing against the concealed blaster beneath his coat. They were no longer the parents grieving their lost children. They had transformed back into what they were meant to be, assassins, weapons of precise destruction. "Lokesh," Margaret said quietly, her voice flat. "He'll be here." Lokesh was an information broker, a fixture in the underworld who dealt in knowledge as much as in blood. He was their only lead, a shadow who whispered of the alien species responsible for the massacre on Earth. Caleb and Margaret had hunted for weeks, burning through contacts and leaving bodies in their wake. They had no time for patience. The pair moved through the crowded marketplace, where alien species from all corners of the galaxy bartered over weapons, drugs, and technology. The towering structures of the spaceport loomed above them, covered in layers of grime and neon lights advertising everything from starship repairs to illicit weaponry. As they approached a darkened alley, a figure emerged from the shadows. Lokesh was as vile as they'd heard, thin, sickly, his skin mottled with scars from countless betrayals. He smiled, showing rows of sharpened teeth. "Caleb, Margaret," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "I've heard you've been looking for me." "Enough games?" Caleb growled, his patience wearing thin. "You know why we're here. Tell us what you know about the aliens." Lokesh's smile faltered. He shifted nervously, the weight of their reputations hanging in the air between them. "I can help you," he said slowly. "But it will cost you. Information like this doesn't come cheap." Margaret stepped forward, her gaze sharp and cold. "We're not here to negotiate." Before Lokesh could respond, she drew a knife from her belt, the blade gleaming under the flickering light. She held it casually, but there was a deadly edge in her posture. Lokesh swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. All right, he stammered, raising his hands in surrender. "I'll tell you what I know." He glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "The ones you're after, they're agents of the Zarnath Empire. You've heard of them?" Caleb's jaw tightened. The Zarnath Empire was a vast, tyrannical force that ruled over dozens of star systems, its leaders rumored to be untouchable. It was said that even the Galactic Federation dared not challenge them. If the Zarnath Empire had sent the aliens to Earth, it meant their mission was more than random. It was targeted. Planned. "They're afraid of what Earth could become," Lokesh continued, his voice trembling as Margaret's knife remained pointed at his throat. "They've been watching your planet's rise in technology, your rapid military advancements. They decided to end the threat before it began." Caleb exchanged a glance with Margaret. Their suspicion had been right. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was an extermination, a preemptive strike against humanity. Their children's deaths were part of a calculated plan. "Where can we find them?" Margaret's voice was ice, her eyes locked on Lokesh with lethal intent. "There's a central hub, an Imperial base," Lokesh muttered, flinching under her gaze. "It's heavily guarded, deep in the Vorthan Nebula. Only the highest-ranking officials of the Zarnath Empire pass through. That's where you'll find them, but getting there is suicide." Margaret sheathed her blade, satisfied with the information. "Suicide for most," she said, her voice as sharp as her weapon. Not for us. Caleb stepped closer, looming over Lokesh. If you're lying to us, we'll find you, he warned, his tone dark. And it won't end as cleanly as this. Lokesh nodded vigorously, beads of sweat dripping down his face. I swear, everything I told you is true. Satisfied, Caleb and Margaret turned and disappeared into the crowd, their path now set. They had a name, the Zarnath Empire. They had a destination, the Vorthan Nebula. But more than that, they had clarity. Their mission was no longer just revenge for their children. This was now a war for humanity's survival. As they boarded their ship, the engines hummed to life, and the stars once again stretched out before them. There was no turning back now. They would plunge headlong into the heart of the Zarnath Empire, where power was concentrated, and death awaited those who dared challenge it. But Caleb and Margaret weren't like the others. They had nothing left to lose. And that made them the most dangerous force in the galaxy. The Vorthan Nebula loomed ahead like a swirling storm of color and chaos, its gaseous tendrils twisting in endless patterns of blues, greens, and violent reds. Somewhere inside that nebula lay the heart of the Zarnath Empire's military power, a fortress world, concealed by layers of electromagnetic interference, and guarded by the galaxy's deadliest defense systems. For most, it was an impenetrable stronghold. But Caleb and Margaret had spent their lives mastering the impossible. Prepare for the scramble, Caleb said, his voice steady as their ship approached the outer edge of the nebula. His hands moved quickly over the controls, rerouting power to the cloaking devices. The freighter, a nondescript vessel to the untrained eye, had been heavily modified with every piece of stealth technology they could acquire. Margaret, sitting beside him, input the final coordinates, her fingers moving with precision and speed. We'll have a 3-minute window to enter, she murmured. If they detect us after that. They won't, Caleb finished, his voice cold with certainty. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering intel, dissecting the Empire's defense grid, and infiltrating underground channels to obtain clearance codes that would allow them to slip through the outer perimeters undetected. Each step had brought them closer to the fortress world, closer to the heart of the Empire, and closer to those who had ordered the annihilation of their family. The ship shook as they entered the nebula, turbulence throwing them against their restraints. The interference created by the swirling gases was their ally now, masking their approach. But it was a dangerous game. One wrong move and they would be torn apart by the gravitational currents that swirled within the nebula's heart. Steady, Margaret whispered, her eyes glued to the readings. Her mind was focused razor sharp. She could feel the pressure building, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. There was no room for error, not at this stage. 10 seconds to cloaking breach. Caleb's fingers flew across the console, disengaging non-essential systems and diverting power to the cloaking field. A deep hum resonated through the ship as it vanished from sensors, just as they crossed the Empire's outer defense line. 3 minutes, Margaret reminded him, her voice tight with tension. Let's make them count. They weaved through the Empire's automated patrols, silent sentinels, starships designed to obliterate anything not authorized to be there. Margaret's heart raced as they slid past a patrol just meters away, the deadly ships scanning the void, unaware of their presence. When they finally broke through to the other side of the nebula, the Zarnath stronghold came into view. The planet was dark, a mass of jagged rock and industrial sprawl, its surface dotted with defense towers and shield generators. Orbiting the planet were massive warships, ready to crush any assault. The heart of the Empire's military might. Margaret exhaled. We're in. The next phase of their plan unfolded with brutal efficiency. Disguised as Empire contractors, Caleb and Margaret docked at one of the lower-class spaceports, where incoming supply freighters and workers were rarely questioned. Their forged identities were flawless, thanks to the black market resources they'd acquired. To the untrained eye, they were just another pair of technicians, blending into the constant stream of workers moving through the Empire's underbelly. But beneath the facade, they were killers. Inside the spaceport, they moved with purpose, navigating the industrial corridors with a practiced ease. Every detail had been mapped out, where the security checkpoints were, how to avoid the automated scanners, and the fastest way to infiltrate the fortress's core. The Imperial forces were overconfident, relying too heavily on technology and fear to maintain control. That arrogance would be their downfall. Their target was the heart of the fortress, an intelligence hub that coordinated all military operations for the Empire. If they could cripple it, they would send the Empire's forces into disarray, creating the opening they needed to strike at the royal family itself. Margaret paused at a control panel, her hands working quickly to disable a surveillance drone hovering above them. Caleb kept watch, scanning the area for any sign of trouble. His senses were heightened, every fiber of his being tuned to the possibility of violence. They had lived their lives on this razor's edge before, and now, that edge had never felt sharper. "Done," Margaret said, standing up and slipping her tools back into her belt. "Surveillance is blind for the next 10 minutes. They moved swiftly, crossing the threshold into the heart of the fortress. The halls here were sterile and gleaming, a stark contrast to the gritty underworld they had passed through to reach this point. Imperial officers strode past, unaware of the threat that lurked in their midst. As they neared the central intelligence hub, Caleb's mind raced through their final plan. They would plant a series of timed explosive charges, each targeting critical systems that controlled the Empire's fleet and planetary defenses. When the charges detonated, the Zarnath Empire's military might would be crippled, giving them the window to strike at the royal family. But before they could set the charges, a group of armored soldiers rounded the corner, their eyes locking onto Caleb and Margaret with suspicion. Time slowed as Caleb's hand instinctively moved to his concealed blaster. He glanced at Margaret. Her fingers twitched toward the blade hidden in her sleeve. The tension was electric. They were one breath away from an explosion of violence. But before anything could happen, an alarm blared throughout the fortress. The soldiers, distracted, rushed past Caleb and Margaret, unaware that they had just let two of the galaxy's deadliest assassins slip through their grasp. Caleb allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Timing's perfect." Margaret nodded. "Let's finish this." And with that, they plunged deeper into the Empire's stronghold, ready to tear its heart out. The Zarnath Royal Palace towered above the darkened capital city, an impenetrable fortress of steel and obsidian, draped in the shadows of night. Within its gleaming walls, the Emperor and his family rested in the illusion of absolute power, unaware of the storm brewing in their midst. Caleb and Margaret had made it this far, through the Empire's defenses, past its most secure installations, and now, to the very heart of the Zarnath dynasty. As they crouched behind a marble pillar in the palace's grand hall, Margaret's eyes flicked to Caleb. His jaw was set, the cold determination in his gaze mirroring her own. They had come for vengeance, but their mission had grown far beyond personal retribution. The Zarnath Empire wasn't just responsible for the death of their children, it had become a scourge on the galaxy, ruling through fear and oppression. Tonight that would end. Their final task was clear: kill the Emperor and his bloodline, the very core of the Zarnath Empire, and in doing so, trigger the collapse of their galactic rule. It was a simple plan, but nothing about it was easy. They moved swiftly through the palace's maze of corridors, their footsteps silent on the polished floors. The royal guards, unaware of the imminent threat, had been lured away by the chaos in the fortress below. Caleb's expertly timed charges had detonated moments ago, sending shockwaves through the palace as explosions rattled the outer defenses. They slipped into the Emperor's private wing. The massive, gilded doors loomed ahead, marking the entrance to the throne room. Caleb glanced at Margaret, his hand hovering near his weapon. "Ready?" he whispered. Margaret nodded, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Let's end this." With a swift kick, Caleb shattered the heavy doors, sending them crashing open. Inside, the room was opulent beyond belief. Golden walls adorned with tapestries of ancient battles, marble statues of long-dead Zarnath emperors, and, at the far end, the massive throne upon which Emperor Caldrax sat, flanked by his royal guard. For a brief moment, the Emperor's cold, reptilian eyes widened in surprise. But it was only a moment. His voice boomed with authority as he rose to his feet, his armored figure towering over them. "You dare enter my sanctum?" Margaret moved first, a blur of motion as she hurled her blade at one of the guards. It struck true, embedding itself in the alien's neck before he could react. Caleb's blaster roared to life, sending a hail of fire into the remaining guards. They returned fire, but Caleb and Margaret were too fast, their years of training turning them into deadly phantoms in the chaos. The guards fell one by one until only the Emperor remained, standing tall amidst the carnage. His lips curled into a sneer. "You think killing me will save your pitiful species? The galaxy will never be free from Zarnith rule." Caleb's eyes burned with fury. "It's not about us. It's about every world you've crushed beneath your heel." The Emperor's laugh was dark, echoing through the vast chamber. "You cannot stop the inevitable. The strong will always dominate the weak." Margaret stepped forward, her gaze steely and cold. "Not tonight." With a snarl, the Emperor activated the energy blade hidden within his staff, its crimson light casting eerie shadows across the room. He lunged at them with surprising speed for a being of his size, the blade humming through the air as it cut toward Margaret. She ducked, spinning out of the way, while Caleb fired shot after shot, each bolt deflected by the Emperor's weapon. The battle raged, but Caleb and Margaret were relentless. They fought as one, their movements synchronized, each strike calculated. The Emperor was powerful, but arrogance had dulled his edge. He had never faced enemies like Caleb and Margaret, two assassins with nothing left to lose. Margaret dodged a final strike and moved in close, her knife flashing as it found a gap in the Emperor's armor. With a vicious thrust, she drove the blade deep into his side. The Emperor roared in pain, dropping to one knee as blood poured from the wound. Caleb moved beside her, his blaster aimed directly at the Emperor's head. "This is for our children." The Emperor sneered even as his life ebbed away. "You will only create a power vacuum. Others will rise to take my place." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then we'll be waiting." The blast echoed through the chamber, and the Emperor fell, his body slumping to the ground in a pool of blood. Silence descended, broken only by the distant sounds of chaos outside. The Zarnith Empire's heart had stopped beating. Margaret sheathed her blade, her breath coming in short gasps. She and Caleb exchanged a look, no words were needed. They had accomplished what they set out to do, but the cost had been immense. The lives they once had were gone, and the galaxy, while liberated, still teetered on the brink of uncertainty. Outside, the sounds of rebellion began to swell. The Empire's hold was crumbling, and the oppressed worlds across the galaxy were rising. The fall of the Emperor had ignited the spark of revolution. As they stood over the lifeless body of the most powerful man in the galaxy, Caleb turned to Margaret. "It's over." Margaret's eyes, hard and cold, softened just a fraction. For now. The dawn of a new age was upon them, but Caleb and Margaret knew that peace was fleeting. They had won this battle, but there would always be more. Together, they walked toward the palace doors, ready to face whatever came next. The galaxy was free, but the hunt was never truly over.